Welcome to the Just Solutions podcast. I'm your host, Aiko Schaefer, Executive Director of Just Solutions. In today's episode, we will explore carbon capture use and sequestration and the impact on environmental justice communities. I'm joined today by Arjun Makhijani, President of the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research. He is a recognized authority on energy and an author of numerous reports and books on energy and environmental-related issues. Welcome back, Arjun, to the Just Solutions podcast.
Thank you so much, Aiko. My pleasure.
So, Arjun, so great to have you back on the show. You were our very first guest on the podcast, and it was a lot of fun to kick it off. I think you and I talked quite a while about doing a podcast together. What do you think?
Well, I love to chat with you. You know that.
We have spent a lot of hours together talking about very important issues. I've learned a lot from you. It's been a joy.
And me from you. I've watched you build Just Solutions from, a very small organization, just you, to what it is today. And I've learned a lot from that. And I really enjoy being your technical expert on energy and climate questions. Actually, in a way, what's important for a technical person is you can just write stuff and it'll sit on a shelf or in some electronic library and nobody ever uses it or it doesn't come to anything. What energizes me about my work with you is I know people will use it. They need it. We're addressing topics that are important topics for the day. And we hope, to address the climate question in a very just way. So it's really fun to work with you.
Well, you just do such an extraordinary job of taking on really, really complex topics, things that you, with your education and your experience, are able to dig in deep and then just make it accessible, make it simpler for people, which I appreciate. And I think our listeners do too. And it's just been great to see the response, how much people have really enjoyed learning from you too. And so, yeah, we couldn't be more excited about the partnership that we have with you and IEER and just all the amazing things that you've done and together learning many, many things to figure out. Technology is a big thing. And it must be interesting for you, having spent so many years in this topic area and working on so many related issues, to see where we've come and where we are now. It's just extraordinary how much money we spend on this. Yeah.
Actually, if you can say it simply, it's clearer to you as a researcher. So if you're thinking complex, if the sentences are hard, then there's something left to be figured out usually. And the simpler it is, the more transparent it is, the better you can understand it. And so better you can explain it.
That's helpful to know. And I think a lot of these topics are kind of deja vu to you. You have this amazing, rich history of things that you've seen us tackle or consider as a country. And it seems like we keep going around and not necessarily learning from our lessons. So it's great to have you come back and remind us that we've done some things, didn't work out so well, but for some reason we keep investing more and more money, hoping for a different outcome.
What is that? Deja vu all over again?
Yeah, exactly. Hopefully we learn our lesson. Well, it's great to take a minute to catch up with you, Arjun. Let's get on with the show. Today, we're talking about the very complex topic of carbon capture and storage and exploring the technology behind it and understanding how it relates to climate justice goals. The federal government is putting billions of dollars into this technology, and we're really excited to be able to have this conversation with you, Arjun, to better understand what this technology is and its implications. So great to sit down with you again.
Yeah, the billions of dollars isn't new. The federal government has been spending billions and billions already for decades. And here we are, and CCS is not there yet.
Yeah, it's a really helpful reminder, Arjun, that we have been hoping that this technology saves the day and have been, as taxpayers, right, this is really our money, that we've been putting into this technology with what seems to be unclear or questionable outcomes. So really looking forward to understanding that more with you today. So can you start by helping us understand, when we talk about carbon capture and storage, CCUS, to make it easier for our listeners? So what is CCUS trying to solve?
Okay, so when you burn fossil fuels, coal, natural gas, oil, basically fossil fuels, the energy source in fossil fuels is carbon, the carbon in the fuel. In methane is also some hydrogen. So basically when you burn it, you get carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, as you know. And so the more fossil fuel we burn, the more carbon dioxide we're putting in the atmosphere and the more warming we're creating. So the idea of carbon capture was when you burn coal, for example, it goes up the stack. Before it goes up the stack, can you do something to capture it, like in a chemical solution, for example? And that, 20, 30, 40 years ago, when people started worrying about climate, it was a very sensible thing to think about because solar power was very expensive. Nuclear wasn't working out that well, and it still isn't working out that well. So there wasn't any easy route or clear route to getting rid of fossil fuels. So carbon capture seemed like a pretty good idea. But now carbon capture is not a very good idea for lots of reasons. Among them, the cost of carbon capture, just the capture part. So you got a coal-fired power plant, it costs money, you have to burn coal to make power, it costs money. Adding carbon capture to it will cost as much as building a new solar power plant. So right now, it doesn't make economic sense to make carbon capture because for the same money, you can actually build a whole new solar power plant.
And that's interesting that you share how that history has evolved, and yet we continue, again, to put a lot of money into it. I encourage our listeners to listen to Arjun's webinar that we have on our YouTube channel, where Arjun goes into detail about how the technology works, and Sylvia Chi from our team talks about the history of our spending and the policy decisions to keep investing in this technology. So please check that out if you really want to get in deep about how this whole thing works. What's interesting about that webinar, Arjun, is you said something that I wanted to follow up on. You say during the webinar that carbon capture is not accomplishing the climate objective, but actually is perpetuating the fossil fuel industry. Can you share a little bit about why you say that?
So how do you capture carbon dioxide before it goes to the stack? The normal method that's sort of commercialized as part of the fossil fuel industry to actually purify natural gas is you capture it in a chemical solution, high pH solution called an amine solution. So you run the gas through an amine solution. The amine solution captures it. And then you have to heat up this solution to recover it. Otherwise, you're going to need new solvents all the time, be very expensive and very polluting. So you heat up this amine solution and liberate the carbon dioxide as a gas and recycle the amine solution. Now, all of that takes an enormous amount of energy. So in a coal-fired power plant, for example, you would need 20 to 30% more coal just to run all the pumps and blowers and heat up the amine solution to recover it than it just takes to make the power. So now you're creating more coal ash. So when you factor all of that in, how much energy does it take to capture the CO2? What are you pumping around? How much natural gas are you using? Because part of our electrical power comes from natural gas. What about all the leaks of natural gas? When you factor it all in, if you capture 1 ton gross, you're actually only netting a 5 or 10% benefit to the atmosphere. So you're only actually capturing about 5 or 10 grams. Sometimes you may even be negative. So you're actually worse off because, if you're emitting a lot of methane, you've got a lot of methane leaks, or you have an inefficient process, then you may be worse off for carbon capture than not doing it at all. Right now, it's a very energy intensive and fossil fuel intensive. And you're creating lots of other pollution. You're creating, more air pollution. You're creating bigger coal ash ponds. You're doing more fracking to make the natural gas.
And from an environmental justice perspective, I think the argument makes a lot of sense to me, which is that through this technology, we're just not really going to address the core issue, which is our reliance on fossil fuels and all the investments in infrastructure that are contributing to climate change. The response we hear back from carbon capture proponents is that this technology will reduce pollution in environmental justice communities. And I know this question came up during the webinar. Arjun, could you help answer that now? Is that true from your analysis?
Well, it's true or not true. So when you burn coal, when you burn natural gas, you create a lot of pollutants, especially coal. In order for this amine capture solution to work, You actually have to remove those pollutions first. Otherwise, it gums up the carbon capture works. So there's sulfur dioxide in the flue gases, the nitrogen oxide, there might be hydrochloric acid. So there are certainly particulates when you burn coal. So you have to remove all of that for the amine solution process to work properly. So you could say, well, if you have carbon capture, you're reducing the pollutants, but you can reduce those pollutants anyway without the carbon capture and the hassle and expense of it. And you should be doing it so long as you're using these plants. And then there's the pollution that is created by the carbon capture process. So making amines is a polluting process. They're liquids. They are nitrogenous liquids. So you create more water pollution. You have air emissions. You have water discharges. So you're actually creating pollutants other than the coal ash and the fracking and more fossil fuels used. You're actually creating pollution in the chemicals that are used in the carbon capture process.
And I've heard you say, Arjun, that, and we've talked about this a lot in our conversations, is the strength of Mother Nature, really letting her do her thing, letting nature heal itself. A really important conversation about conservation and really this need for us to really change our behavior, change the way in which we do things. I think for some people, carbon capture is something that is an option to address the urgency of the moment. They may not think that the technology makes the most sense, but really, by and large, are holding their nose so that we can quickly save the planet given the limited time that we have. Is that where you're landing on this as well? I mean, what are your thoughts about that argument?
Yeah, so in fairness, we do need to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We need to reduce the burden of other greenhouse gases. So we're right now about 420 parts per million of carbon dioxide. Pre-industrial was about 280. So we've added 50% carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, give or take. And we do need to get that down. But if you say working with nature seriously, then we're talking storage in soil, doing agriculture better, doing forestry better, reforestation with native trees and ecosystems. That's complicated, but actually could be cheaper and often is cheaper if it is done right, according to a recent IPCC report. So yes, we do need to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. My priority would be to reduce methane, which is the main component of natural gas, because a much more powerful greenhouse gas. When you remove 1 unit of methane, you're actually helping Mother Nature remove another little bit of methane because you're helping it work better. We've overburdened Mother Nature with too many pollutants. When you remove some, then Mother Nature will remove some for you as a bonus. So methane is like that, carbon dioxide, not so much. So in the short term, I think we should be spending some of those billions at least, if not most of them, on trying to remove methane and accelerating the carbon dioxide reduction. So reduction of emissions. Let's get out of fossil fuels faster. There is the political side. What about all the communities? What about all the workers? What about the million people who are in the oil business? That's a political economic question we absolutely have to solve. If we say just solutions, as the name of your organization, then justice for workers absolutely has to be part of it. But it doesn't mean we need to go on burning fossil fuels. That's not a very good way.
At some point, Arjun, when we were working together, you did look very closely at these communities that rely economically on fossil fuels and really began to look at the economics of the situation and to the extent that alternatives could be a viable option. I think that most of the conversation is about citing wind energy, solar energy in low-income communities, in fossil fuel communities. You talked at length more about the manufacturing opportunities. Could you share a little bit about your thinking and the things that you've been looking at about this transition and the economics of it? I know that you're not an economist, but I think just your understanding of the technology and what it will take to build cleaner alternatives, what you see as this transition in a more complex and thoughtful way than the way we've been looking at it.
Yeah, thank you, Aiko. I've done a lot of thinking about the dollars and cents end of this thing for a long time. So the standard environmental answer, energy transition, there'll be a lot of jobs in solar and wind and, and so on and so on. But I don't think that's enough. In fairness to people from say, West Virginia or Wyoming or Texas or North Dakota, that's not enough. In my opinion, economies, a lot of the vibrancy of economies run on what they export to other communities, which brings in money from other communities into there. So when you export more from a country, that's how Japan emerged from the ashes of the war, Germany, or, more recently China. So that problem is not solved if you say, I'm going to bring a solar panel manufacturing. There are too few jobs in that. And solar and wind are primarily construction oriented. There's no fuel going into it. So West Virginia, for example, big exporter of electricity. That brings a lot of money into the state. I think the deal should be placement of those jobs. Part of the just transition has to be manufacturing, creating high value jobs, not necessarily in energy, but in other industries. It could be in energy. So in West Virginia, we've talked about this. If you're going to manufacture wind turbines for offshore wind, why not put that in West Virginia? West Virginia has a big manufacturing sector. It could be there. It has the electricity and infrastructure. So I think we should think about the communities that have fossil fuels in a more empathetic way in terms of jobs, and I think more realistic way from an economic point of view.
And that creativity is so important in the thinking deeply about how we go about this. We interviewed Jeff Johnson from the Washington State Labor Council, the AFL-CIO, and he talks a lot about the construction jobs. People who've built fossil fuel pipelines could also be building water pipelines as we try to prepare for climate change, being able to build the infrastructure that our country just sorely needs, especially to protect environmental justice communities and the ability to think differently about that skill set, not necessarily transitioning to a completely different set of skills, but to actually maintain those skills and that expertise to really be building those better alternatives to both transition us to clean energy and to prepare us for the climate impacts.
Yeah, the expertise question is very important. I'm glad you brought that up, Aiko. So another excellent example in the construction trades, which are well-paid trades normally, is natural gas pipeline laying, it's an important source of jobs, or oil pipelines. Now, if you get rid of that, those high value, highly paid jobs are not going to be easily replaced. But we do have technologies like community geothermal wells, for example, that could use the same underground space for the infrastructure, provide renewable heating, and very secure, be very good for resilience, and provide high value jobs. We have to think more richly, let me say, about the complexity of the transition. And I don't think we are. Just like we're thinking, in electricity, we're just going to plug in solar and wind and batteries and, we have the same system. I think that kind of thinking is just not big enough and good enough. And we're losing the opportunities to do it right by not thinking big.
And we should definitely have you back on the show to do another segment around these clean energy alternatives in terms of what it will take to significantly transition to those options. So when we're talking about carbon capture and storage, as it compares to these alternative technologies, when you look at the technologies that we are investing in or could be investing in, what do you think we should be doing?
We haven't talked about use. When you started the show, you said carbon capture, use, and storage. Let me mention use as a good example in which we could be investing. Most carbon capture that happens, the use of carbon dioxide when it's injected into the ground is to make more oil. That doesn't solve the fossil fuel problem. But there is a technology being developed in Canada where if you capture carbon dioxide from the air or from a cement plant or some other steel plant and locate it near a slag hill. So slag is made, when you make steel, you have mountains of slag near Pittsburgh. So slag as a waste material, when you pump carbon dioxide through it, you can make a cement block. So now you have avoided a huge amount of emissions in the cement making. You've used a waste material, so you're cleaning up neighborhoods. You have some carbon dioxide emissions from capturing the CO2, but it would be offset, possibly more than offset, by making cement blocks. Now, that's a technology in carbon capture and use that could be quite worthwhile. And I think instead of spending billions trying to attach carbon capture to hydrogen production from natural gas or coal-fired power plants, that's the kind of thing we should be doing. Or injecting it to produce more oil. We're really spinning our wheels and wasting money when there are opportunities waiting for more investment.
And I've heard you talk about the displacement of concrete production, which clearly has environmental justice implications, given most of those concrete companies are environmental justice communities. But, I think I've shared with you, Arjun, that chemistry was not my best subject in high school. But when you talk about the concrete blocks that you would create from the byproduct of carbon capture, how safe is that? Is that something that we're using to build something that humans are living in and working in? Do we know what that's like?
Well, the concrete blocks look like a normal concrete block. So, it won't replace reinforced concrete, the concrete that has steel bars, that you use for skyscrapers. But it will replace your concrete blocks for whatever structural purposes or your student bookshelves that you make with concrete blocks. So it's a fraction of the cement. But looking to cement is very important. First of all, hydrogen currently is not technically enough developed for cement production. Cement produces carbon dioxide in two ways. One is just by burning the coal, and the other is by reducing calcium carbonate to lime. So calcium carbonate has CO2. You drive out the CO2. So you have carbon dioxide. Even if you had completely renewable energy for cement, you'd still have a lot of carbon dioxide emissions. So if you're replacing the lime for here with slag, then you're getting rid of carbon dioxide emissions that are currently very hard to get rid of and are quite a large proportion of global emissions.
Interesting. Well, I think it's important that you draw attention back to the use in terms of carbon capture, use, and storage. So let's dig into the storage word. Storage to me is when you take something that you want and you put it away for something, something that you're hoping to use later. And I don't see that necessarily as the proper word in this case. So in this notion of storage, I think it's an important thing to talk about, which is once you capture the carbon, it has to go somewhere. And can you share a little bit about what the different ways that we are, going about essentially getting rid of the carbon that we're capturing?
Yeah. So, this is one advantage of using it for basically capturing it in cement. So it'll be locked up, is that semi-permanently, essentially. If you capture it in a, say, natural gas-fired power plant or coal-fired power plant, you normally won't be able to pump it underground where the plant is. It wasn't built with that in mind. So you won't have a suitable place to pump it into a geological formation like an saline aquifer so that it'll stay down there. So what you have to do is you have to take the carbon dioxide you've captured, you have to compress it, you have to put it in a pipeline. It could be 50 miles, it could be 100 miles, it could be 200 miles to a location where you could pump it into a geologic formation and where there's a high probability that most or all of it will stay down there. Now we're talking about staying down there for hundreds of years or thousands of years, essentially permanently. So that's what you do with it. And that's part of the energy and expense because you have to take the carbon dioxide, compress it, pump it. Like any other gas that's distributed, natural gas is distributed that way. You compress it, you put it in a pipe, you pump it. Now, this has been done. Most of the carbon dioxide does stay down there. It's, the time aspect is not that verified. But of course, you put carbon dioxide in pipelines, they could explode, it could leak. It has happened. Carbon dioxide is heavy, it'll settle down, It's a gas that can asphyxiate you. So it has its risks. And so when it goes through communities, it increases those risks. And so my overall take on this is, yes, let's find ways to reduce the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Let's do it. Let's work with Mother Nature. Let's look to uses like the cement block example that I've given you. But carbon capture and sequestration in the context of fossil fuel capture and putting it underground somewhere, I'm not a fan of that.
And let's be clear, where we're depositing the waste, it's not in Beverly Hills. It's not in downtown Manhattan. I assume it's going to be in environmental justice communities.
That's a really good question. Are there saline aquifers under rich communities? Maybe we ought to do a map of that.
Well, and my understanding is that that's a little bit of the draw of the current fossil fuel infrastructure, is that it could be the location in which we are putting a lot of this waste. Is that correct?
There are saline aquifers in fossil fuel communities in many places. The United States has a lot of them. They're not uniformly distributed, of course. And so those who are promoting carbon capture and sequestration say we have plenty of capacity in these saline aquifers, and they're not wrong. From a technical point of view, they have a point. But you do have to get it there. It will go through communities. It will create those risks. Now, doing things has a risk, not doing things has a risk. So there's no zero risk thing where we are, or ever really. So who bears the risk? Is it necessary? What's the low risk option? And for climate, my first question is all this: will it help solve the climate problem fast, urgently, economically, as we need to do right now? And the starting answer for that is, if you couple carbon capture to fossil fuel use, which will perpetuate it, is that no, that's not a good investment from a climate point of view. We'll discuss this again with hydrogen. There are good ideas in it. It's very important. It could help, but you have to think it through, not from the point of view of perpetuating the natural gas industry or, building pipelines. If it doesn't pass the climate test and the urgency of it, then it doesn't pass. Then the next step is not even worth discussing.
And that's really helpful to understand and to make that distinction. The other thing I wanted to raise too is that I think there's an attempt to include the voice of community around this technology. When you look at the investments from the federal government, that industries that want to develop and site carbon capture technologies have to have a stakeholder engagement plan, and they also have to have a conversation or include community benefits.
I think the Biden administration has kind of opened up to a reindustrialization strategy for the overall economy. And I think in the energy transition, we should think more broadly in that context. I also do think that going to poor communities and saying, jobs, for something that's not very good environmentally and kind of perpetuates the fossil fuel industry is not a healthy political approach to revitalizing and making all communities vibrant so they don't need jobs for doing things that are not desirable. They're attracted to it. I would be attracted to it if I were living in those communities. Job comes, you have a more vibrant community, fair enough. But I think that's not a very good way to do it. As I said, I'm not against carbon capture. We've talked about the use. It's not cheap to think about, carbon capture and slag and making cement blocks or other ways of making cement. It's going to be a huge investment. And that's the conversation we ought to have with communities, is where does working with nature, good jobs, climate, where does it all intersect? And that intersection is huge. It's powerful. It's a lot of jobs. But I lament that even on the environmental side and climate side, we are not thinking about it big enough and in the new ways that we need to think about it.
I think as we encourage communities to engage with these industries, that there's a real push to have this complex conversation you're having, both around what does it really take for the community to have those jobs and to have jobs that remain and pay well, not just building and then being done and moving on. And then subsequently the environmental hazards and other hazards. I think that just saying that we have to ensure community benefits is the simplest part. The question is, what does that actually mean? What are communities able to get or advocate for, and what counts? And I think we're definitely being a little too soft and a little too unclear about what it will take to create direct community benefits.
Absolutely. I completely agree. So, until recently, environmental justice, economic justice, affordability of energy has been kind of an add-on. Climate is so urgent, we got to build solar power plants, and, solve the CO2 problem. I believe that, we need to put economic justice, affordability, environmental justice in the center of it. And we ought not to think about solving the climate problem in a way that would be diverse from it. So if it doesn't have affordability, if it doesn't have getting rid of natural gas for cooking that creates indoor, we shouldn't be talking about it. So if we think about it, and now I think it's moving in that direction. So what you're talking about, you have to have a conversation with the communities. That's the first step, but it's only the first step. We have to put the technical considerations and the economic considerations more in the center. Not 40% benefits is vague. It's a start, but I don't think it's substantial enough in the sense that I want. I want to start with the technical. What's the great thing to do? What will benefit the community? What will marry the jobs with climate and economic vibrancy and get rid of the pollution that we have now?
That makes a lot of sense, Arjun, for us to really come to the core of the conversation, which is to really make sure that we're thinking about technologies that are actually accomplishing the objective of addressing climate change, that bring broad economic prosperity and opportunity, that ensures public health and safety. And it seems to me from this conversation that carbon capture and storage is not checking a lot of those boxes. So appreciate you spending time with us to help us better understand this, and hopefully for communities to continue to understand what this is and how they can keep engaged and how we can keep pushing alternatives. I think the conversation, again, let's have another show talking more deeply about these other alternatives. I think we'll have you back to talk about hydrogen hubs, which I think environmental justice communities rightly call potentially another questionable technology, but again, want to do the due diligence to understand it and be able to see how these function and what the implications are for environmental justice. So we always ask our guests one parting question to just make sure that we're ending on a positive note, because there's so much to be hopeful for. I think communities are out there doing extraordinary work around clean energy alternatives and jobs, and really leading the way with solutions that really are working and having an important impact on community. But Arjun, when you are doing this work, what makes you hopeful about the environmental justice movement today?
Well, I think in the last few years, we have changed to some extent. We're oriented in the right direction. We're not thinking about environmental justice as an add-on or affordability that's over here in a separate box from the energy transition. We are thinking, and it's more and more mainstream organizations are thinking about it. Even corporations are thinking about it to some extent. It's become part of the mainstream political conversation, not generalized, but I actually am very hopeful that it has taken at least partial root. When I started looking at the energy transition seriously about 15 years ago, it wasn't really a conversation. It wasn't. Now it is a serious conversation. We've made some progress. There's some real money there. I think we have to give it more substance, but I'm very hopeful about it. I think we can.
I can't agree with you more. Really praising those environmental justice organizers and organizations for all the work that they've done to really make this a national conversation, one in which the Biden administration has responded to, and really this historic moment in which we are investing in better alternatives and thinking about the impact on community and the role that they can play to help make sure we get this right.
Could I call out the indigenous communities? I have learned so much from them. The working with nature, it all comes from there. You know that. My friend Russell Jim of the Yakimas passed on, but he was brilliant. I learned so much from him. I think we need to bring that thinking more into the center of how we're thinking about the energy transition. But I am very hopeful. I think we can do it.
I think that sounds great. And centering Mother Nature and the leadership of those who understand and historically have worked to center nature and the role that it plays in healing and protecting all of us. Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Thank you, Arjun, for being with us today. And thanks to our listeners for joining us on the Just Solutions podcast. Special thanks to our producer, Tayler Ward, and our recording engineer and editor, Angel Bautista. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to know more about our work at Just Solutions, visit our website at justsolutionscollective.org. You can also follow us on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook for the latest updates. Together, we're driving community-created and equity-centered solutions to the climate crisis. We hope you'll join us for our next episode.